morning, everybody. I welcome everyone to this second colloquium of what we labeled as Beyond Brain. And in this, the idea is to promote discussion at a scientific level on matters regarding consciousness, everything pertaining to consciousness and free will, and many other topics which are now currently of scientific interest and gaining momentum. When we talk of consciousness, doctors in general and neurologists in particular, they know consciousness only as a property of an organism. The sense when a living organism is aware or self-aware, and when it is responsive to its surroundings, we say it is conscious. That does not mean that is the definition of consciousness. It only sort of addresses the property of a living organism which exhibits consciousness. So as we see, consciousness is something which defies definition. There have been many attempts to do it biologically, in terms of quantum physics, in terms of mathematics, and there are so many models which are now attempting to try to pinpoint or define what is consciousness. And for neurologists so far, traditionally, consciousness means, what is consciousness? It means when a person, when the brain is functioning, we are conscious. When the brain is not functioning, we are not conscious, or probably even dead. So that has been the traditional definition of consciousness, but now we are moving away from this aspect. Current research tends to take us away from this, and to discuss all this, we are having 2 sessions here today. And instead of making it as just a sort of didactic talk or a lecture, we thought we'll make it a bit more interesting in terms of a debate. The first session is to be moderated by Professor A.V. Srinivasan. For doctors, he needs no introduction. For other people here, he has been the professor and head of the Institute of Neurology, and later he is currently the Professor Emeritus at the Tamil Nadu Dr. M.G.R. Medical University of Neurology. I invite him to take over the proceedings and conduct the first session. Professor Srinivasan.
Professor Vasudevan, who has started the initiative, and Yogaraj is going to become the real pillar for this particular aspect of consciousness coming together. And I always say the meeting of the minds beyond the brain. It's going to take place, and I just wanted to give a twist to the language, and I say consciousness is a trick of the memory, and self-awareness is an illusion of language. Is it a fact or a fiction? I think we are going to get the answers from, does consciousness need a brain? No, says Narayanan, and yes, says Yogaraj. I think we will listen to the lecture first, and then we'll have an open forum discussion. I invite now, because we are neurologists, yes, consciousness need a brain. Yes, by Yogaraj.
So, Kalai Vanakkam, Namaste, and good morning to everybody. As introduced, being predominantly a neurology population here, I'm an out-of-the-box endocrinologist who is speaking on consciousness. So, not a well-versed person with this topic, but quite interested in this. I'm going to talk on consciousness does not need the brain. And the question today is, does consciousness need a brain? It's quite uncommon that in a debate or in a trial that the judgment gets pronounced even before the trial starts. I think this is one such situation. The meeting itself is called Beyond Brain. So my role is very simple, just to justify the verdict which has already been pronounced here. That comes next. So we are all seen as medical practitioners, even otherwise, that the modern science and modern medicine has stumbled and fumbled about various aspects in the universe which we see, which we wonder what these are. For example, we claim to save lives, but we do not clearly understand in modern medicine as to what life is or where life is. The same thing true with mind. We do not know where mind is, what mind is, although the modern medicine has struggled to give a definition and to localize it to some organ in our body. It's equally true with consciousness also. But in that direction, the attempts that have been made are here. The Oxford Dictionary says the state of being aware and responsive to outer surroundings. So that's one of the definitions in Oxford Dictionary which says responsiveness to outer surroundings. A step more forward from a psychology textbook which says awareness of one's unique thoughts, memories, feelings, sensations. So it's both internal and external. When that person is responsive to both the internal stimuli and the external stimuli, he's said to be conscious as such. But is that all consciousness? We know for sure that these definitions are not so comprehensive. Many aspects, what we see as consciousness, what we experience as consciousness, cannot be illustrated by these definitions, what we see here. Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, while he was describing about mind, he defines mind as of three states. A conscious mind, which we all experience on a day-to-day basis with awareness about the perceptions, feelings, thoughts, etc. The pre-conscious mind, which is related to the data that can be readily brought to the consciousness. So if you think about it, you can just recapitulate and then tell about this. Or, very interestingly, an unconscious mind. So even when there is no consciousness, there is a state of mind. That's what he describes. Refers to data retained but not easily available to the individual's conscious awareness or scrutiny. This is an ancient Indian concept of defining consciousness where it is called Turiya, or more appropriately Cha-Turiya. Cha is fourth and is called the fourth state. The three common states being Jagrut, which is awareness as we are now, or Swapna, the dream state, or Sushupti, which is a dreamless sleep. And consciousness is said to be the background in which all the above are happening. It's very interesting to see here that when we have a good night's sleep, we wake up in the morning, something is watching this sleep for us to tell us in the morning, saying that I had a very good sleep, I did not have even a dream last night, it was a fantastic sleep. So even during the deep sleep, when the conscious state is not to be so much aware as such, even in that time, there is something which is watching all these things. So obviously the consciousness goes beyond all these aspects, what we experience on a daily basis. So when we talk about consciousness, we obviously talk about the thoughts, perceptions, and memories being the components of consciousness. So it's a very common dogma that we have created over centuries, at least in the past few centuries, that all these aspects of our cognition, like the thoughts, perception, feelings, originate from the brain as a substance. This is a very materialistic view of looking at this. Is that true? And we do have evidence that we do experience medically to suggest that yes, consciousness may originate from the brain, or for that matter, the components of consciousness like the thoughts, perceptions originate from the brain. The various example I've illustrated here is a person who is under the influence of alcohol is not quite aware of what is happening around him. Somebody who's had a head injury, somebody who's had serious brain infections like abscess or encephalitis, or for that matter, even if we want to study somebody in that situation, experimental studies like brain stimulation studies, or when there is a damage to certain portions of the brain, either due to a surgical trauma or due to an accident. In all these situations, the brain or the function of the brain does get affected, and the awareness or the perception or the other cognitive aspects of the brain goes down. And for us to define this very easily, we always say the Glasgow coma scale is low, the consciousness is low, the patient is semi-conscious, unconscious, and whatnot. So there is an argument to suggest that maybe the consciousness originates from the brain. But could it be possible that brain is actually merely a transmitter rather than the site of origin of all these happenings, the thoughts or perception or the consciousness? Example, today we all have the smartphones, or even those who have a dumb phone for that matter. If we think that these sound which we hear from the phone originate from the phone itself, it is erroneous. It transmits the signal which obtains from the cloud here, from the space here. It's very similar to, for example, a television or a radio. The television does not produce the picture. The cathode ray tube does play a role here, but obviously it just transmits what is being given to it from outside. Could it be possible that the brain just acts as a transmitter here, that it obtains something from outside and then just transmits? So the real question is, does matter produce consciousness? Matter in this question is the brain. Or for that matter, does consciousness produce matters? Just leave alone the brain as such. But the matters that we see across here, from the table to the chairs to the space to the planets and everything. Which is true? Is it the chicken or the egg? To answer that, probably I need to dip slightly into the physics. And if there are any physicists among the crowd here, please help me out in the next few slides. The classical physics has always taught and told us that matter is made up of particles. For example, the light travels, it has been described previously that light travels as particles in straight line, and matter gives rise to energy, but not the vice versa. The atomic bomb, for example, it explodes, produces a great amount of fusion or fission energy, but the energy cannot be converted to matter. That was the traditional view before with the classical Newtonian physics. But is that all? What we see in this universe, we all know that less than 1% of what is being manifest here is constitute only less than 1%. What we cannot see constitute more than 99%. Say, for example, the visual spectrum. The human visual spectrum is limited to from this hertz to this hertz. The human audible frequency is limited from this hertz to this hertz. So outside this frequency, we are not able to see the ultrasonic waves for that matter, or the the UV rays or the infrared rays. But there are other creatures in this world which are able to see. There are many more beyond this which we have not even discovered as such. So what we see, that's the reason why this has been described as a Maya, an illusion, that we are able to perceive only very, 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 very tiny fraction of this universe as such. So is that true that what we see as matter is made up of truly just particles, or is it more to it rather than that? We know from the physics again that what we see as atom, the electrons, the protons and neutrons, the vast majority of the atom is an empty space, more than 99%. Only 1% is made up of the particles. So to move away from this classical physics of a materialistic aspect, the quantum physics came up. And what it said was, any small piece of material like a photon or an electron can act both as a particle and as a wave. So particle meaning as a matter, wave probably is not behaving like what we would expect a matter to behave in. And it can be whichever one. This is more profound, depending on the perspective at which one looks. So what they said was, the photons and electrons can behave like a particle or like a wave, and depending on whether a person is looking at it or not, the behavior can change, and thus forcing them to be either a particle or a wave, indicating that the behavior of all these particles, or whatever you want to call it, can be changed by the human consciousness. And that's the conclusion of the quantum physics. Just to illustrate that, this was the very famous double slit experiment which was conducted to prove the point. If we imagine there is a slit, and if we throw, say, some marbles through the slit, and what you would expect on the other side is a narrow single band, a single vertical band to be formed. So they tried with an electron gun, they tried showering the electrons through this single slit, and obviously it formed a single band, as we can see here on the other side. That is expected. So you would probably think this is also behaving like a marble, and this is also very much like a particle. Very similarly, if you put two slits through it, you would expect this to form two bands, because this is behaving like a particle. It should ideally form two bands as such. But in contrast, what they observed was, this produced, I don't know whether how easy it's visible here, it produced what looks like a fringe pattern or an interference pattern, very much like a light. If you allow light to pass through these two slits, the waves, we know now that the light travels like waves, and they intersect each other. Due to the interference pattern, they produce dark and light fringes. When they set the electrons through these two slits, and that's exactly what they observed, that they did not make just two bands, but they made an interference pattern with dark and light fringes, proving that electrons does not just pass like a particle, it can pass like a wave, it can travel like a wave. But the next part of the experiment is the more interesting thing. They could not understand. This was at an aspect when the entire world was thinking electrons, photons, all these are particles, and hence they are expected to behave like a particle. But when they saw an interference pattern, the fringe pattern, they could not understand what is happening, how the electrons are passing through these slits. So they put an observer there through the slit to watch what is happening. They cannot observe the electron as such, but they wanted to see what is happening, how this is being passed through, what are the movements which are being caused when the electrons are passed through the slits. The moment somebody started watching through the slit as to what is happening, the wave pattern disappeared, the interference pattern disappeared, the electrons formed two bands very nicely, as you would expect from the particles. And this is a very famous double slit experiments in the field of quantum physics, which just flabbergasted all the scientists to put it more correctly, all the previous generation scientists who believed in the classical Newtonian physics. And thus came the origin of the quantum physics. Subsequent to that, this was Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winner for the originator of quantum theory, who proclaimed that I regard consciousness as fundamental, and I regard matter as a derivative from consciousness, not the vice versa. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness. And this is a profound change in the way people were looking at the field of physics, people were looking at consciousness as such, and this was a big turn in the field of this consciousness. So if we talk about whether the brain produces consciousness, here is an experiment, here is a big world of quantum physics which proves to the contrary. Not just the brain, but the entire universe, what we experience here, the entire matter, particles, all these things are changed, the behavior of which can be modified, and in fact these can be produced, and these are produced by the consciousness. So the quantum physics concludes that consciousness, that which is unmanifest, that which is poorly understood by us, creates the matter around us. It's not very dissimilar to what we believed in this culture, which says nothing gives rise to everything and everything goes back into nothing. The Shiva being described as the universal consciousness, and the Shakti being the cosmic energy. We always say, without Shiva, no Shakti, without Shakti, no Shiva. They are intertwined to each other, cannot be separated from each other. Outwardly, this may look like a religious concept, but actually, in the culture, in our culture, all of these were given in the form of spirituality. Not many people will understand quantum physics, but if you put it in a very simple form like this, many would understand. So the aspect of universal consciousness and cosmic energy were intertwined with each other. And these are mere personifications of the concepts what the scientists in those generations had in India. Shiva may be a personification of something, Shakti may be a personification of something, but it is much easily understood. Going away from the physics, the world of physics, are there any medical proofs that consciousness is beyond the brain? And there are few aspects which the medical world has seen and experienced, and these are listed here. I'll go through one after the other. The first is a field of near-death experience. The second is the end-of-life recovery of lost consciousness, and third being memories of past life. Near-death experience, the definition in the Oxford Dictionary is an unusual experience taking place on the brink of death and recounted by a person on recovery, typically an out-of-body experience or a vision of a tunnel of light. So these are people who are nearly going towards or nearly gone to death. By clinical definitions, by medical definitions, their brain is dead, they are being resuscitated after the cardiac arrest and brought back to their life as such. So they have touched death and then come back into this world. The experience of these people when they were studied were very, 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 very similar. Very similar. The experience of the near-death experience itself and the after effects it produces in their life were very similar to each other. And this has been extensively studied and published for many decades, I should say, in high-impact journals, including The Lancet, for example. And there were quite a few neurologists and psychologists who were quite interested in this field. What they universally tell that when they went into this sort of death situation, they experienced that they were completely out of their body and they were in a very different world which was more real than the day-to-day world which they have experienced so far in their life. There was an exceptional mental clarity which they never experienced in their life. There was an unconditional love. They were ecstatic. There was an overwhelming peace which they never experienced in their life so far. They did not have to carry the burden of memory. They did not have to carry the answers in their mind or their brain for that matter. All the answers which they had, which were unanswered for centuries, well, when I say centuries, including the previous births for that matter, were answered in that situation. And they experienced that they were not isolated in that universe. They experienced them to be part of the entire universe and one mingling with each other as such. The description of out-of-body experience when studied medically, at least one of the studies suggested that it was 97% accurate with that description. When I say this description of accuracy for that matter, what they did was somebody who has had a near-death experience when they came back to life, they went and interviewed and asking what happened during that time period. Their vivid descriptions of the doctor who was wearing this color stethoscope, this color shirt, that person waving their hand, this person doing something, these are all beyond the normal comprehension of a normal functioning brain as such. But here is a brain which is clinically dead, and they are still able to come back to life to say that this was what exactly happening during that time period. We're also able to experience other features like vivid colors, the colors which are not realistic in this world which we are experiencing, the sounds which they have never heard before. They were able to foresee the future events which are going to happen. The time and space merges together. There is no past, present, and future. Everything is here and now. The change in thinking, that was clearer, faster, and that was more logical for that particular person who never had such a logical thinking before. As I said, crossing the boundaries of space and time, a sense of revelation, and another common feature which they experience is a panoramic life review. When I say panoramic life review, right from the time of their birth up until the time of this particular moment, they were able to see a full review of their, it's not like a snapshot, a full video review of their entire life picture within that time span. It's very difficult for us to understand because this person might have been clinically dead for a few minutes. For them to experience the entire life pattern is very difficult, but that's what I said. When we go beyond the five senses, the distinction between time and space merges. There is nothing there, nothing yesterday, nothing tomorrow. It's all merges into one another. The after effects were also very similar. Most of these people who have had a near-death experience were more spiritual after, not religious as such, but more spiritual after this experience. They were more compassionate. Materialism, people who were even crorepathies and multimillionaires, money did not matter to them after this. Status is of no significance for them after this. And they were able to appreciate the lives around them in a much more profound manner compared to how they were before. And death is something for them more welcoming now after this experience, that they want to go to that world because they saw what was more real, what was more comforting, what was more soothing, what was more a loving world. So they did not have any fear of death because they believe this is a transient world and that is the real world as such. So this is the first aspect where actually the brain is dead clinically, by all your ECG, EEG and whatever means we want to record, but still the person is able to come back to experience and tell all these factors which were accurately described and documented by experienced cardiologists and other people. So this enhanced mental function, and if we were to think this mental function of consciousness, the mental function of consciousness, thoughts and perception are localized to the brain, then it cannot happen. Perceiving things from outside the body, again, which is non-physical, interaction with diseased people who were gone already. The other second situation is end-of-life recovery of lost consciousness. So people who have had severe dementia,